Welcome to Social Work Foundations. I'm Dr. Karen Smith-Ratavi, and today we're going to cover system theories and some major ideas around the concepts of environment and person and environment, as well as ecological perspective. We'll think about social services organizations and how they are a part of the greater resource system that serve clients, and we will be thinking about the person environmental fit, eco mapping, and then some specific organizations such as social service setting, being within a host organization. We have associations and self-help group, as well as ideas around human dignity and diversity, as we always try to consider when we talk about social work, our ideas of engagement with others in context and making sure that we are guaranteeing their human rights and human dignity. So we'll begin with the person and environment model, and this is a basic social work approach that's considered when individuals within their environment. This is the person-environment fit. So we have theories using this framework assess multiple systems to determine what the focus of the intervention should be. So we're not always just looking at the individual. Quite often we're thinking about the larger systems of the family, maybe the school or other organization that the family and the individual are interfacing with, the larger community, social services organizations. So there's a whole variety of dynamics in the individual and context of their environment. So here we have again this graphic which depicts the person with all these interacting systems. Now, this is it's really much expanded upon with Mary Richmond's social diagnosis early on with social forces and the dynamics that the individual is nested in. But remember, these are social forces happening here in terms of the middle, the individual being in the middle. The forces are different, they're dynamic. These systems all interact, and there's transactions within and across the systems. The larger circle, outside circle, includes economic opportunity, policies and laws, and even human rights values in the society. Then we always want to think about the community. What are the institutions available in the community, the programs and services? This is where our social services organizations are typically most engaged. However, we do have small group work with tribal groups, associations, self-help groups, mutual aid. And then we have, of course, the family system, which is a very significant system for us to focus on, especially when we're working with children or we're working with issues like domestic violence. But you never suggest that those issues are in isolation. We're always thinking about these nested systems and how they interact and how they create pressures on the family, on the individual, and those transactions and interactions across the systems. These are very fluid systems. They're illustrated here kind of in a rigid structure, but you really need to be kind of creative here in your mind now to be thinking about how these systems are dynamic and fluid and they're overlapping and intersecting and really kind of this whole sphere of influence around the individual and their family. Okay, so let's look at person-environment fit. We're always looking to examine the fit between the person and the environment, including the physical or natural world and the social aspects. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about the physical or natural world. And right now, in the era of global warming, climate catastrophe, it's very clear that we have to be more and more thoughtful about the natural world. Air quality, all these issues that people are affected by. And then, of course, we have COVID-19. That's another aspect of the natural world, a virus, which jumped from mammals to humans and became a worldwide pandemic. So we have both the physical and social environments being influenced by culture, values, and norms within the society. Think back to that graphic with the cultural influences. And then when there is not a good fit for an individual in his or her environment, the social worker seeks to help make changes in the system based on the client's needs and interests. So the idea of fixing the client is generally not the pathway forward. But usually we're looking at how the client can adapt to environment and how the environment must be changed to meet that client's needs and self-determination and also just their human rights and their dignity. Frequently, these are oppressive systems that they aren't adapting to, and we don't want to encourage a client to make an adaptation to something that's unfair or unjust. So we're always having to think about how do we make that person environmental fit as social workers, as facilitators? How do we influence that in a way that the individuals making their adaptations, but also, very importantly, the larger systems are being adapted? Okay, so let's look at family in context of groups, community, and society. These are ecosystems. Now, this family, it's a nuclear family. It's probably the most irrelevant graphic of a family I could have chosen, but each family is different. We have a lot of families living in household, grandparents are present. So use your imagination when you have a look at this graphic, but recognize all the different groups and systems that are going on for this family. So of course, they have schools, youth activities, which would include youth groups, sports club. They have faith organizations. There may be self-help groups such as parenting groups, women's groups, other kinds of groups that are related to mutual aid. You have local businesses that are serving the family or not. And that might be an opportunity to engage in economic possibilities, opportunity to gain employment, for instance. Of course, we have health services, clinics, and hospitals, non governmental programs and services. And then we have critically important in the physical environment is what about the play space, the physical space in neighborhoods for people to have leisure, to rest and relax. We know that Jane Addams and the Women of Hull House made inventory of many aspects of the community, and one of those inventories was play space. Could families find a place to rest and relax and be together in a cohesive setting where they were valued and had opportunities to engage each other and play? So this is not just children, but families having an opportunity to come together in that kind of space. Of course, then we have law enforcement, police, and courts, and schools. So this is just a general snapshot of the family in context of the groups, community, and larger society. These are ecosystems. So these, again, use your creativity. This isn't really a flat circle. It's a really dynamic set of interacting systems here, just like the last graphic. Okay, ecosystems. Let's look at that more closely. In the ecological perspective, or the eco model, the focus is on growth, development, and the potentialities of human beings with all the properties of their environments that support or fail to support the expression of human potential. So interventions are on improving interactions between individuals, families, groups, or communities. Those are our clients and their respective environments to promote continued positive growth and development. So think about continued positive growth and development. We want our clients, the people we serve, to really reach their greatest potential, their personal greatest potential. And so we're looking at environmental systems. We're looking at how do we create opportunity for people to really prosper in these environments, prosper in their growth, their development, opportunities for employment, opportunities for education. So we are focused on, in the ecological perspective, the growth and the development and the potentiality of human beings. And we need to look at how we support or fail to support that expression of human potential. So let's look at another ecosystems approach, and this graphic captures the dynamics of the many aspects, including especially the arena up front in that yellow circle, which is the community and organizations. So the green circles are organizations, and we know in communities we have a cluster of many different social services organizations. You can do a quick analysis in your community and you'd find a number of them, and some of them would be nonprofits and faith-based, others will be charity-based. So you find different organizations available to help people, support people, and help people solve their problems. And that's in the arena of formalized policy context, being the outer ring. And then we're always looking at the population that's being targeted as well as the problem. You can see the overlapping kind of Venn diagram there, how this, again, very, very dynamic, moving, shaping based on the problem set forth. And then we have the greater community and greater cultural context. This is somewhat similar to that outer ring that we looked at in that first graphic with the person in the center of all the dynamic systems. Okay, so let's talk about social services and those agencies. So we have public and private social services. So we need to think about how government bodies will have social services organizations based on legal mandates in the United States, federal mandates at the highest level, but also state mandates within the state of California or elsewhere. And then there's also non-governmental organizations, sometimes called NGOs, or private social services that are considered nonprofit, and they are very much voluntary, and they could be also some elements of commercial for-profits sectors delivering services. So that might be therapeutic services in which people are privately paying for access to a very sophisticated intervention, like so that's common in drug rehabilitation programs, for instance. So look at this table provided by Dubois and Miley in your text, and you'll see that public services, you'll see the authority, scope, affiliation, structure, income sources, and hiring practices on the left. Now look at the difference between these two things. At the authority level, the state, local, and federal laws for public sector is really different than the articles of incorporation or the bylaws of an organization like a small agency. Now, what are the bylaws and articles of incorporation? So nonprofit organizations are built based on some agreements with the government that they're nonprofit and not taxed, and they have to have a set of bylaws or rules as well as a board of director and articles of incorporation that indicates their business model. Now, their business model that does not mean that they're for profit. And then again, just because they're not for profit doesn't mean that their agency employees are making poor income. Sometimes you'll see private sector places as a very good place for employment, and sometimes you even wonder if they are meeting nonprofit because you'll see very large salaries of some of the higher level leadership. So we know that in the scope, the laws specify the exact intent and scope of programs underneath public services. And then we'll look at the small agencies. We'd have mission statements that gives direction for flexible programming. So flexible programming, that really gives the social services organization, that nonprofit setting in all likelihood, the opportunity to do a lot of innovation because it's a flexible programming kind of context. And that's one of the strengths of small NGOs, nonprofits, as well as profit sectors, the opportunity to very flexibly innovate and come up with new ideas. So affiliation, we know that state and local government social services are clearly identified as being a part of the services provided by government. And then the affiliation, organizations that are private, nonprofit, they tend to function on their own, although they are within a network of other organizations typically that collaborate and cooperate. The structure of government organization is highly bureaucratic, highly hierarchical, and can be a real sense of frustration in trying to engage in that environment. And then you can find that same characteristic in a non-governmental organization or a nonprofit. It really does depend on the size of the organization. So a really large organization, say Catholic Charities in a large city, it very well may be such a large organization, you're going to see some of the same aspects of bureaucracy and getting caught in bureaucracy. But smaller organizations with maybe 10 employees or less, that organization is not going to be so hierarchical. Like all likelihood, they're probably going to be more like a flat organization where power and hierarchy is more flattened out and shared authority over areas of the organization. We know that government services are funded by the tax base, and then private and nonprofit, as well as for-profit, you would find voluntary contributions, people making donations. You may have fees for service, and that fee for service could be on a kind of a flexible schedule depending on the client's capacity to pay. There's other sources of funding that organizations frequently will apply for grants, and a lot of those grants will come from the government or larger foundations in the community. And then the question is hiring. So we know that for government, the hiring is generally civil service, but more and more you're seeing contracted service within government. So just be aware of that. It's not always permanent state jobs. There are contracted positions too, especially in times of decreased budgets and austerity. So then hiring practices within the private sector would be based on agency standards and practices, how they have identified the job title, the roles, and how that that particular job fits into the larger organizational structure, and that they would have criteria. They'd be a lot more flexible as to who they could hire. The government, typically civil service, would be a far more rigid set of criteria because there's very rule bound, whereas the small nonprofit would have opportunities to be more flexible quite often. Now, I will say that with a caveat. Some of these nonprofits really do find that they need a master's degree of social work employee because they want to be able to do billing, and they want to be able to bill the government sources and insurance. So that is going to be important to think about. You'll find that they may actually have rigidity about who they can hire in terms of being an MSW, especially somebody who's able to be licensed at the clinical level in order to make the kind of billing that would be a fee for service cash flow. And a lot of organizations, that's a reality for them. They can't really make it without some fees for service. That doesn't mean that everything to do is fee for service, but they need some base of cash flow based on the ability to charge. So let's talk about word usage, programs versus service. We use the term social services and human services synonymously, and you'll see that throughout the program. Frequently, it's often social services. But we need to recognize that programs are based on goals and objectives falling underneath the mission of the organization. So let's give an example of the charity organization providing Meals on Wheels. This is one program of many in most instances. The organization typically focusing on elders in the community. And the services are those found within the program. So services found within the Meals on Wheels program. And they'd be very specific. So a service might be home visiting as an add-on when dropping off meals. So organizations will also take on guardianship for elders. So when you think about Meals on Wheels, they might become familiar with somebody who's really living in difficult circumstances and having dementia or other problems. They want to continue to live in their home, and they need guardianship services to make sure that their bills are being paid and that they're not being taken advantage of in terms of financial abuse, because that is a concern for elder abuse. Also, in general, physical abuse, emotional abuse of elders. So guardianship services might be taken on by that same organization that provides Meals on Wheels. I think you'll find that that's common. So guardianship is, again, another program. So you want to think about programs are large and services are those very specific, concrete things accomplished within the programs. Okay, so let's talk about social services and the nexus between social worker and host organizations. So you're going to find that often you are going to be in a host organization that's not classically a social services organization. And that means that you would find yourself maybe working in a school. And the goal of that school is to educate children. So the mission statement around education and growth and development are very clear. They're not incongruent with social work, but the social worker is in the host setting. And so you want to think about how that affects the social workers. Do they get pulled into the rules and regulations of the schools, or do they get to act autonomously? The answer is really somewhere in between, because school social workers really must straddle our professional obligations and the system in which they are nested. So think about the nestedness of systems. So if a child's exhibiting behavioral problems at school that may be best served with family therapy, if something at home is creating stress, that manifests in the school setting. So family therapy, if the school social worker would not offer family therapy, but they may identify that family therapy is needed. They may partner with the family trying to build some rapport, find out what the possibilities are, engaging family in counseling or that word therapy. I think it's be careful about counseling and therapy. And then make some of those determinations of what's possible, and then there can be some referrals made out of the school setting to a capable counselor or therapist. But look, let's face it, school social workers are frequently dealing with the school environment itself, like when a child is being bullied at recess. The target for intervention is that the child, or would it be the school setting? And school social workers are really positioned well to recognize that the school setting is a huge part of bullying, the culture of the recess time period, the culture of the institution, that school, and how children feel like they can bully, or they feel like or alternatively, they are being held accountable not to bully. And so school social workers will frequently have youth groups and other kinds of activities with students to build sensitivity. And then if the child themselves is being bullied, work with that child directly on some life skills, and so that they can be more self-protective using some of their own abilities to communicate, stop, don't do that, you're hurting my feelings. Those kinds of things, trying to teach students how to respond. Now, this is different depending on the age and stage of the child. Obviously, adolescence is quite different. You're dealing frequently with physical acts of hostility at times, of bullying. So you have to look at each child and each age and stage and craft the intervention as necessary. But just remember, there's an intersection of school and family happening for the social worker, and the social worker can link between these two systems quite effectively. So, 4 systems to consider in social work practice. We've talked about the different ways of thinking about systems, but just remember there's the change agent system. And that's the system influencing the change, the social worker, their agencies, policies, and legislation. For example, school is the host. So the change agent system. And then we have the client system, the person or group or the social worker engages with. An example, the individual as well as the peer group and teachers. The target system, the focus of intervention across systems, and we might look at multiple points of target in the example of bullying in the school system. So you can think about target working with the child or youth on their life skills, target working with the teachers to help try to create a better culture within the school, target the school administrators to get them to be more responsive to bullying problems and intervene earlier in a preventative manner, target families. How do we help the family support their child? So there's multiple targets there. So these are different systems. And then the action system, we have related systems that collaborate with the change agent system. So in the school example, schools as host organizations, collaboration is essential between the administrators, teachers, and others who engage with the social worker and family to solve the problem of bullying in the host setting. So these are the different systems with which we interact as social workers. And these are the different systems we think about, especially in terms of targeting intervention, selecting intervention and targeting intervention. So school as host organization, we've talked about this now, and let's just kind of wrap this up. This is the Australian Association of Social Workers and how they see teachers, school social workers, and other support staff be the first to recognize physical signs or changes in mood, engagement with learning, behavior, and attendance. They recognize that these can be individual and family distress indicators. Vulnerable children, that can be the case because they've experienced trauma, neglect, family violence, and other difficult situations. And it's recognized that schools might be the only safe and stable environment that a child has when they're in very difficult circumstances. So within the school setting, students will frequently disclose the experience of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and it can be brought to the attention of the child protection and family support specialists. So children will recognize when they trust the setting, they trust the teachers, they trust the social workers, that they can disclose in order to seek some help and support. So we also would have children in out-of-home care that would be foster care most frequently. And the relationships at the school can be important to provide that continuity and support the child in their own resilience in the face of the most difficult of family circumstances. The school setting can be a site of school, family, and community collaboration to foster child protection, well-being, and learning. So here you saw all the different targets being captured by the Australian Association of Social Workers. School as host organization. It's a challenging environment at times for social workers because there might be moments where the system's too punitive in the social worker's perspective, but it can be a really great environment because we know that kids can engage there for 8 hours a day. We can identify what the problems are, what the possibilities are, build upon the strengths of the child because we have consistent engagement. This is kind of a captive audience idea. The kids are coming back every day. They come by mandated by law. So schools can be a great opportunity for growth and development of children, with the social worker being an important facilitator in the processes of intervening. Okay, so let's say we have a child that is being bullied, again, to go back to that example, and we want to start looking at that family. So let's say that Alonda is being bullied, and so you see Alonda in the the different green bubbles here. You see her mom, you see her father outside of the main family system there on the left. You see friends, you see two different social workers, you see the elementary school. You can start to map all these different ways in which Alonda is affected by, or the relationships that Alonda has with different players in her system. And you can notice the double arrows indicate that transactional approach to how we think about systems and how message and information is moving across and between systems. Now, look at the broken arrow between Alonda and her dad. There's definitely some distress there, and that's the broken arrow indicates that. He's also outside the family system. We don't know the full story there, but the social worker who developed this map decided to put Alonda's father outside the family system because there is some distress there. Maybe Alonda's father doesn't live with the family. This is a good way to think about sitting down and mapping a child's ecological or person environment fit. And you can do this kind of activity directly with the client in eco mapping. Okay, so let's talk about relationship, equality, transactions, and empowerment. We're always thinking about empowerment. In order to meet those needs of empowerment, we always have to think about how the social worker and the client works together collaboratively. Is the relationship a partnership that both the social worker and the client bring their unique knowledge to effectively work together? So for that example of a child being bullied, the social worker would work with that child. Let's call him Jose. They work with Jose to determine how Jose is experiencing bullying, what he identifies as his problem statement. You would observe the environment, how instances in how Jose tends to be bullied. Is it only at recess, or is he also being bullied in the classroom? You'd talk with the teacher to find that out. You'd be looking at the full range of experiences that Jose is having related to bullying, and you would be asking Jose throughout that process in a collaborative manner to bring together the full picture, the narrative of what's really happening that honors Jose's perspective as well as the teachers. And of course, we wouldn't generally ask other peers because of the confidentiality that Jose has. Now, we have to always view our client as expert. Jose is our expert. And we want to avoid the social worker taking on the role of knowing all. Jose knows a great deal about his circumstances and what he needs. So if the social worker considers Jose an expert, he can identify the dimensions in the social environment and can start setting goals for change. Now, social worker would facilitate this. Jose's a child, so working through some case management, some case planning with Jose. Now, we also need to recognize that empowerment practice acknowledges the social worker should not place his or her own values upon the client. That's just something we always have to be thinking about. So as we think about empowerment, the social worker and the client work together to build power in order to achieve goals. This may occur as the social worker links the client to informal and formal support systems and or political activities. Now, in the case of Jose, we're not going to have Jose in all likelihood moving into advocacy work related to bullying. We could do that, but probably not. What we're going to really do is thinking about how can we link Jose to maybe some youth club activities might be a good opportunity, maybe a sports group where he can start to become more physical and can start to feel like he fits in more with the other boys. Also for formal support systems, maybe Jose and his family does need some counseling, and we could connect them or plug them into the local mental health authority. So the informal would be group activities like sports, youth groups, or other kinds of opportunities for Jose and the community. And they might be school linked. It might be after school programming. Now, I don't want to say that Jose wouldn't be involved with advocacy. We always want to have people that are experiencing a problem speak for themselves. So you may do some advocacy work to end bullying as a policy issue, and Jose might be at some point in the really good position to speak kind of that truth to power. So let people know what his experience is and the kinds of changes that need to happen. Maybe greater funding for after school care, after school programs for kids that are having challenges, which would be based on life skills and growth and development for kids that are experiencing challenges in their local community, in the school system, even with their family systems. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about host organizations. They are a challenge, especially for law enforcement and prisons. If an organization is punitive in terms of the underlying values, so in the school, the belief is in the growth and development of children is possible. Reaching that highest potential is what the school is about. But an organization like a prison or law enforcement is punitive typically in the underlying values. And we have to ask ourselves, how does that impact social workers engaged in that practice setting? So we have questions about self-determination. We know that Jose in the school setting could really start to look at what Jose wants to accomplish and have self-determination about next steps. However, in the law enforcement setting, that could be really different. So we find ourselves in challenging circumstances of advocating for the client in these very closed and rigid systems. And we know that there are pushes and pulls in the environment that may actually feel hostile to the ideas of social justice. How do we cope with that? These are important questions if you're going to work in those sorts of systems. And then we always have to think about what's going on in the larger social environment. Right now, there's a lot of concern about people not feeling safe with public safety officers, with law enforcement. And so as Black Lives Matters continue to unfold in the social movement that's occurring right now, how we move forward with policing and setting environments of safety versus criminal punitive approaches is going to be important as we continue to have the national narrative for how to be more effective in communities and build spaces that people feel trust and don't feel like they're going to be targeted by police or at risk for their health and well-being because the police are using violence against people or being highly punitive or treating people as suspect, especially people of color. So not looking for people reaching their highest potential and their greatest quality of life, but actually seeing people from the deficit perspective and assuming that they are bad people rather than assuming that we're all trying to reach our highest potential. Okay, so as we select interventions, we want to think about that person-environmental fit. Is in the center of the ecological perspective. Social workers aim to evaluate fit and tailor interventions to either the person, environment, or both. Remember, we are thinking about the environment, not just fixing the person, so to speak. The intervention should reduce stress and or promote positive growth and development. The level of stress varies to the extent to which the individuals perceive the ability to obtain the necessary resources. So if the individual sees themselves as being able to work through the problem and find their resources to solve their problem, their stress level is going to be lower. If people feel hopeless, and hopelessness is an important concept, if people feel hopeless, their levels of stress and just kind of feeling discarded by society is palpable. It's very obvious. So we want to evaluate the life stressors, the key factor in the ecological model, and the external forces that are present and real or the perceived threats. So as we're selecting interventions, we need to be mindful. Okay, so let's say we select a self-help group as an intervention. So in your text, this is important because we typically think of social workers as being highly engaged and working as a case manager or working as a counselor. But one of the important things that social workers do is support self-help groups, mutual aid groups as a facilitator, helping to pull together these groups, helping to facilitate groups and then step back as the group comes to greater forming and norming. So mutual aid is really critical, and it's a valuable community resource, and it's above and beyond professional services quite often because many groups will start to meet without a social worker even present once it moves into a stage of maturity. That doesn't mean a social worker is never present, but frequently groups will be started by social workers that eventually may exit because consumer leadership takes on an important and necessary role. You'll see that this is an important part of American society. It estimates as many as 10 million people are involved in self-help activities. Self-help activities have all a strong influence or orientation to substance abuse. So you'd have Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, NAMI for family members of somebody with a persistent and serious mental health condition. But you also have support groups for people with disabilities as well as parent support groups. Long-term commitments are made in these self-help organizations, and the friendships and the deep ties that can be formed there are really critical to developing social support amongst people with common problems, commonalities of their needs. So people that go to seek self-help might also find that they need this as a supplement to their own sense of family. Maybe their own family support is fragmented and they need to go find a group of their peers to be together and feel supported and feel accepted. So just remember there's a whole range of self-help and mutual aid groups. And self-help activities are all over the place online, and we'll see more and more people involved in quote quote coaching for online. And that's different than social work, but it looks a lot like it too. But just remember, we have people that are trying to overcome issues like substance abuse. They're dealing with grief and loss related to bereavement. They may have a disability or serious illness. We have caregiver support needs when a caregiver is taking care of someone who's, for instance, terminally ill. There's parenting groups to learn greater parenting skills through formalized education approaches. So there's lots of different ways in which mutual aid groups are put together and can support our clients. Now, you think back to Jose, he might benefit from a youth group. I think he would, in which maybe life skills and sports are some of the target areas for growth and development. And this would be a group where he wouldn't be treated like he's got something wrong with him, but it'd be a group where he can go and grow and be amongst other kids who are similar to him, maybe an after-school program, as I mentioned before. Okay, so here's a picture of me in earlier practice times. This picture was taken with permission because it was an official program photograph when we were marketing our program, and all of the people here are real clients and they signed off a waiver to be in the photograph. And here I am as social worker, but I am not doing the talking. The gentleman on the right of me is actually starting to take over facilitation of the group, and I'm leaning in and I'm listening. And so that's the role of social worker, starting to move out of helper, but more like active listener and facilitator. So I didn't have to facilitate this veterans group once this gentleman started getting engaged. It was really rather remarkable too, because he was a veteran and he was able to open the group up to greater vulnerability and talking about their unique issues and needs. And that wasn't possible really for me as an outsider. I don't have the experience of being a veteran, a combat veteran, who's seen a lot of difficult things, experienced the challenge of the combat zone and the health implications of some of these experiences like PTSD. So I was a facilitator there and engaging as an outsider, and I continued to step back and allow this gentleman, his name's Henry, to take on more. And then other people in the group became more and more engaged. You saw natural leadership starting to emerge as people started to look to each other for their stories and to care for each other and to express that they got it, they understood. Now, me being there as a social worker does provide some professional legitimacy, but the goal is to step back as much as possible and empower the consumer leadership, which you see here. Okay, so let's talk about associations. They're another kind of group. These are functional associations or functional communities, and we've already asked you to get involved with the National Association of Social Workers as a student member, and that's an association, for example. But you'll also see larger groups like the Alliance for Children and Families, the Association of Community Organizing and Social Administration. These are functional communities where people with like or common interests come together to further professionalize their area of concern, their interests. And when you think about NASW, that's the further professionalization of our organizations for social work and how we are perceived and what our job descriptions are like, the kinds of opportunities that we have as social workers in the larger society. So this is an important associational life too. It's not a mutual aid group, but it is an affiliation that comes together to work towards a common cause, a mission, a vision. Okay, so we've covered this idea of person and environment. I'm going to just close with this picture here to just remind you that we have all these interacting systems, and you'll see associations at the groups level. You'll see institutions, those are your social services, those are the different government supports in the larger society. Remember, you have the family and the individual nested there, and there's all kinds of dynamics around spirituality, education, economic forces, political forces, the psychological and biological, sexual and social. These are the different, in the center of that circle, these are the different forces that the individual experiences in their day-to-day living. And we have all systems interacting with transactions across and within these systems. Okay, let's talk about human dignity now. We want to look at these social services organizations, whether they be government or private nonprofit, and we need to start looking for the indicators. Are they really giving their clients the opportunity to experience human dignity? And there are some indicators. So let's look at this box provided by our authors, Dubois and Miley. So they have a series of questions. If you walk into an organization, and you'll have that opportunity in your field placements, and you walk into an organization and you'd make a setting observation, and you would start to wonder, okay, what are the signs of human rights and dignity? Are the clients being informed of their rights? So you might look at, are there signs and brochures and forms available for people? Self-serve? Are they available in easy to reach locations? Are the areas in the office actually accessible for disability? Are meeting rooms large enough and substantial enough? Are there ramps? Any other disability related resources? That's a critical important element of human dignity. We would also want to know, in the larger environment, does the agency have access by transportation, public transportation, or others, routes of getting to the location? Or maybe it's a neighborhood-based service and you can walk there. That's critical. That would be great human dignity opportunity because the organization is nested in the environment of the people. So does the agency have policies and procedures that are sensitive to diverse cultures? Does the staff reflect a range of diversity? You can start to make these observations if you're going in to make a setting observation. You could also ask critical questions about the makeup of the organization based on human resources data. Does the agency provide staff development and training related to diversity issues? And is diversity widely defined, not just around black, white, or brown as color, but other diversity such as sexual orientation, diversities related to disability, all the different range of diversities. So how about orientation to practice to consider all the different social and cultural contexts? So we always want to see that the organization is thoughtful about all the cultural contexts in their greater environment. And we want to see whether or not consumers are involved in the program evaluation and policy development and decision making. And clearly, has the agency formed links with indigenous resources in the community? These are your First Nations people. Are First Nations people being welcomed into the agency for services, or do they feel disenfranchised or fragmented from that kind of service? We know that that's a real and persistent problem for First Nations people. And then, importantly, does your agency or this agency participate in community coalitions that press for social change? So are they reaching out beyond the organization and cooperating and collaborating in larger networks of community organizations working towards a common cause or goal to move forward with change agendas and targets for change? Okay, thank you. This concludes our lecture on social services systems, ecosystems, person and environmental perspective, and the general ideas related to systems theory.